Ladies and gentlemen, in light of recent legal challenges by former President Trump, it is imperative to reaffirm a commitment to reason, evidence, and democratic norms. The machinery of justice operates not through volume or spectacle, but through the calibration of facts and law. Democracy depends not on loyalty to individuals, but on allegiance to institutions that constrain power. To impugn lawful process with conspiracy is to erode the very Enlightenment values on which our republic rests. Rational discourse, not demagoguery, must prevail. Commitment to reason and evidence is not just an abstract ideal, but a foundational principle that underlies the progress of civilization. In the face of political turbulence, legal controversy, or social upheaval, it becomes even more critical to anchor public discourse in rationality and empiricism. Reason, in its purest form, is the faculty that enables humans to transcend immediate impulse, bias, or tribal loyalty, and instead consider arguments, weigh evidence, and draw conclusions that align with reality rather than ideology. Evidence, in turn, is the substance that gives reason its power, the empirical content that allows us to test hypotheses, verify claims, and distinguish between truth and falsehood. The political realm, especially in democratic societies, must operate within a framework of rational discourse and evidence-based argumentation. When political actors reject these principles, they do more than challenge their opponents. They corrode the epistemic foundations of democracy itself. Democracy depends not merely on voting or representation, but on the capacity of a public to deliberate, to argue in good faith, and to revise beliefs in light of new information. Without reason and evidence, public debate devolves into mere performance, where persuasion is achieved through spectacle, fear, or repetition rather than truth. Historically, the Enlightenment marked the moment when Western societies began to elevate reason and empirical observation as the primary tools for understanding the world. Science, law, and governance each underwent revolutions premised on this shift. Science abandoned dogma and tradition in favor of experiment and observation. Legal systems moved from trial by ordeal or divine judgment toward procedures based on testimony, forensic evidence, and rational standards of proof. Governance, likewise, became increasingly grounded in constitutional design, checks and balances, and policies evaluated by their outcomes rather than their symbolic appeal. In this context, any attempt to undermine legal procedures by appealing to conspiracy theories or extra legal sentiment represents not just a political challenge, but an epistemological one. It replaces reason with suspicion, evidence with insinuation. The public is urged not to examine facts, but to join a narrative. These narratives often draw on cognitive biases, such as confirmation bias or proportionality bias, that predispose people to believe that large events must have large causes, or that one's own side must always be righteous. Such impulses are natural, but reason exists precisely to help us transcend them. The legal system, though imperfect, is one of the most rigorously reason-based institutions in society. It is built on rules of evidence, adversarial testing of claims, precedents, and transparent procedures. Legal decisions are documented, appealable, and subject to scrutiny. When a political figure challenges this system not through lawful appeals, but by casting doubt on the legitimacy of judges, juries, or procedures without substantiating evidence, it is not a correction of the system. It is an attack on the very norms that allow the system to function. It is essential to recognize that commitment to reason and evidence does not mean the system is always right or immune to error. Indeed, the strength of a reason-based system lies in its ability to self-correct. Scientific claims are revised when better evidence emerges. Legal verdicts can be appealed. Policies are debated, tested, and improved. But this process only works when participants are willing to engage in reasoned debate and to submit their beliefs to the tribunal of evidence. When people reject this process outright, claiming, for example, that all unfavorable outcomes are rigged or that only one version of events is legitimate regardless of evidence, they withdraw from the common epistemic ground necessary for dialogue. Moreover, in an age of social media and rapid information dissemination, the threats to reason and evidence have become even more acute. Misinformation spreads more quickly than corrections. Emotional appeals, especially those based on fear or outrage, are more viral than dispassionate argument. Algorithms reinforce pre-existing beliefs, creating epistemic silos where contrary evidence is filtered out. In such an environment, the individual's commitment to reason and evidence becomes not just a civic virtue, but a form of resistance. Resistance to manipulation, to tribalism, and to the erosion of shared reality. Educating citizens to value and apply reason and evidence is therefore a central task of any functioning democracy. This education does not require advanced degrees or technical expertise. It begins with teaching critical thinking, encouraging curiosity, and rewarding intellectual humility, the willingness to say, I was wrong, or I don't know. It involves cultivating habits of checking sources, asking for evidence, and distinguishing between assertion and argument. It means understanding the difference between correlation and causation, anecdote and data, opinion and fact. These are not mere academic distinctions. They are the tools that enable a society to make wise decisions under uncertainty. When political figures flout these standards, it is not enough to respond with partisan outrage. The defense of reason and evidence must be nonpartisan, because it precedes and undergirds all political disagreement. If one cannot agree on the basic methods for discovering truth, if one side believes in evidence and the other in revelation or suspicion, then there is no shared basis on which to argue. This leads not to democratic debate, but to epistemic warfare, where the goal is not to persuade, but to dominate, not to inquire, but to control the narrative. The stakes of this are not abstract. When policies are made without evidence, they fail. When legal challenges are based on fiction, they waste public resources and undermine trust. When citizens no longer believe in shared facts, they become susceptible to demagogues who offer certainty in place of complexity. In such conditions, even the most resilient institutions begin to crack, not because they are overwhelmed from without, but because they are hollowed from within. Reason and evidence, then, are not luxuries of elite discourse, they are the survival tools of a democratic society. They are what allow us to resolve disputes without violence, to adapt policies in the face of new challenges, and to correct mistakes before they become catastrophes. They remind us that truth is not the property of any one party or group, but the product of a collective, painstaking effort to understand a complex world. This effort requires rules, patience, and good faith, and it begins with the unwavering commitment to let reason and evidence, not anger or allegiance, guide our public life. Integrity of democratic institutions is the backbone of a functioning society governed by the rule of law and the collective will of its citizens. Institutions such as courts, legislatures, electoral bodies, and law enforcement agencies are not mere bureaucratic constructs. They embody the principles of accountability, transparency, and impartiality. Their legitimacy rests not only in the letter of constitutional texts, but in the public's shared trust that these bodies operate independently, fairly, and in accordance with the rule of law rather than political pressure or personal loyalty. In a democracy, power is distributed across institutions precisely to prevent its abuse. This distribution includes checks and balances that ensure no single individual or branch can dominate the system. The judiciary is designed to interpret the law independently of political winds. Legislatures are meant to debate, represent diverse viewpoints, and pass laws through deliberative consensus. Electoral commissions safeguard the integrity of elections, while executive agencies are tasked with implementing the law as written. These structures, though designed with formal roles, derive their functional legitimacy from widespread adherence to norms, expectations about behavior that aren't always codified, but are nonetheless essential. When political actors challenge democratic institutions without compelling evidence or bypass established legal procedures to seek favorable outcomes, they threaten the equilibrium upon which the system rests. Erosion of institutional integrity often begins subtly. A public official questions the motives of a court. A leader suggests elections were unfair without substantiating claims, or a lawmaker ignores legislative norms in favor of partisan tactics. Each act may seem isolated or justifiable in the moment, but collectively they chip away at the perceived neutrality and stability of the institutions that govern society. What makes democratic institutions resilient is not only their design, but their insulation from short-term political interests. Judges serve long terms or enjoy lifetime appointments to shield them from electoral cycles. Electoral commissions are ideally structured to be nonpartisan, with transparent processes and public scrutiny. Law enforcement, while accountable, must operate without political interference. These safeguards are not mere traditions. They are deliberate barriers against the concentration of power. Undermining them for temporary advantage damages their credibility long after the immediate crisis has passed. Trust in institutions cannot be manufactured overnight. It is cultivated through consistent performance, accountability, and a reputation for fairness. Once lost, trust is hard to rebuild. When leaders cast doubt on electoral outcomes, for instance, they are not just challenging a result, they are diminishing faith in the mechanism that allows peaceful transitions of power. When courts are labeled as biased simply for ruling against one's interest, the message is that the law should serve power, not principle. This is a reversal of democratic order and a return to arbitrary rule, where authority flows from the loudest voice, not the most reasoned argument. It is also important to distinguish between legitimate criticism of institutions and attempts to delegitimize them. Democracies thrive when institutions are held accountable and reformed where needed. Whistleblowing, investigative journalism, and peaceful protest all contribute to institutional improvement. However, when critique is wielded as a bludgeon to discredit any unfavorable outcome, it becomes a strategy of erosion rather than reform. The difference lies in intent. Reformers seek to strengthen institutions by correcting flaws, while opportunists seek to weaken them to expand personal or factional power. The health of democratic institutions also depends on a shared cultural commitment to their value. Citizens, officials, and public servants must internalize the idea that loyalty to institutions supersedes loyalty to individuals. Civil servants must carry out their duties regardless of who holds office. Judges must apply the law consistently, irrespective of political affiliation. Legislators must respect procedural norms even when it is inconvenient. This internal discipline is what separates democracies from autocracies. Not just the form of government, but the behavior and values of those within it. Media plays a crucial role in maintaining institutional integrity by providing transparency and accountability. Investigative reporting brings institutional failures to light while also serving as a corrective mechanism. However, media can also contribute to institutional decay if it becomes a vehicle for unchecked disinformation or partisan narrative building. A free press must balance its adversarial role with responsibility, ensuring that skepticism does not become cynicism and that critique is grounded in fact rather than innuendo. In the digital age, where information is easily manipulated and disseminated, this balance becomes increasingly vital. Education systems, too, have a part to play. Civic education should not merely teach the structure of government, but should instill an appreciation for why those structures matter. Students must understand not only what the Constitution says, but why it says it, why separation of powers exists, why due process is essential, and why an independent judiciary is critical. A citizenry that lacks this understanding is more easily swayed by charismatic leaders who promise to bypass institutions in the name of efficiency or loyalty. Democratic institutions are designed to be slow and deliberative precisely to avoid rash decisions made in passion or panic. Populist movements often frame institutions as obstacles to the will of the people, portraying them as elitist, corrupt, or out of touch. This rhetoric can be powerful, especially when institutions have failed to deliver fairness or justice in the past. However, the solution to institutional failure is not demolition but reform. If institutions are flawed, they must be fixed, not sidelined or attacked. Bypassing institutions in favor of personal rule or mob sentiment leads to governance by impulse, not reason. The promise of democracy is not just that the people rule, but that they rule through stable, transparent, and just mechanisms. Once democratic institutions are compromised, even temporarily, the damage is difficult to contain. Precedents are set. Future leaders inherit a weakened system in which rules are more easily bent or ignored. Institutional decay is rarely sudden. It happens incrementally as norms are abandoned, standards lowered, and public trust diminished. Rebuilding these structures requires more than policy. It demands a cultural recommitment to the values of democracy, impartiality, accountability, transparency, and the rule of law. It also requires courage from within, the willingness of individuals inside institutions to uphold their duties, even when pressured not to. Institutions are not faceless monoliths, they are made up of people. Their strength lies in the integrity of the individuals who serve them. A judge who refuses to bow to political pressure, a clerk who enforces procedures fairly, a journalist who reports the truth in the face of intimidation, these are the acts that uphold institutional integrity. Conversely, when individuals within institutions become complicit in their erosion, by remaining silent, cutting corners, or serving partisan goals over public duty, they become agents of decline. International history offers numerous examples of democracies that have eroded not through coups or invasions, but through the gradual hollowing out of their institutions. Leaders who rose to power through elections later weakened courts, cowed legislatures, and manipulated electoral systems. Often, these changes were legal but not legitimate, procedural but not principled. The outward appearance of democracy remained while its inner core was gutted. Such outcomes are a stark reminder that the form of democracy alone is not enough. Its institutions must be preserved in spirit as well as structure. Danger of conspiracy over lawful process is a critical concern in any society that values democratic governance and the rule of law. When individuals or groups reject established legal mechanisms in favor of conspiracy theories, they shift the foundation of legitimacy from evidence and procedure to speculation and distrust. This transformation is not merely rhetorical, it has tangible consequences for institutions, public perception, and the stability of governance itself. Lawful processes exist to manage conflict, adjudicate disputes, and ensure fairness across different political, social, and economic contexts. Conspiracies, by contrast, offer an alluring but corrosive alternative narrative that undermines the very mechanisms designed to deliver justice and accountability. At its core, lawful process depends on the principles of transparency, due process, and procedural fairness. Courts rely on rules of evidence, cross-examination, and impartial judgment. Investigations are conducted with oversight and guided by standards. Appeals and judicial review ensure that no decision is above scrutiny. The very idea is that legitimacy is earned not through outcome alone, but through adherence to fair and open methods of arriving at that outcome. Conspiracy theories disrupt this framework by suggesting that all outcomes unfavorable to a particular interest are inherently rigged or corrupt, regardless of the procedures that produce them. This mindset is incompatible with any system grounded in law. Conspiracies do not require evidence to gain traction. Instead, they exploit cognitive shortcuts and psychological biases, such as the tendency to seek patterns in randomness or to assign malicious intent to complex phenomena. In times of uncertainty or perceived loss, people are particularly susceptible to explanations that offer clarity and emotional reassurance. Conspiracies thrive on these moments, presenting simplistic villains and secret plots where the legal process appears slow, complicated, or neutral. Where lawful procedure demands patience and scrutiny, conspiracy demands outrage and certainty. This emotional contrast often gives conspiratorial narratives a rhetorical advantage, even though they lack factual grounding. The proliferation of conspiracy theories about legal and political processes erodes public trust, not only in individual outcomes, but in the entire system. If people are led to believe that courts are corrupt, that elections are preordained, or that enforcement agencies act under hidden agendas, then the social contract begins to unravel. Participation in democratic life requires a basic level of trust that one's voice matters, that grievances can be addressed through legal means, and that power is not exercised arbitrarily. When conspiracy replaces lawful process, that trust dissolves, and what remains is a volatile space ripe for manipulation, fear, and ultimately conflict. The danger is compounded when political leaders endorse or amplify conspiracy theories. Their authority lends credibility to claims that would otherwise remain on the fringes. When a public figure declares without evidence that an election was stolen, or that the justice system is a tool of a shadowy cabal, they invite their followers to reject legitimate institutions and instead place faith in alternative, often unverifiable sources of information. This shift can incite harassment of officials, delegitimize peaceful outcomes, and even provoke violence. The leap from rhetorical suspicion to physical action is alarmingly short when people are convinced that legal avenues are no longer available or trustworthy. Legal systems are designed with imperfections in mind. Mechanisms like appeals, oversight, and judicial review exist precisely because no human process is flawless. This openness to correction is a strength, not a weakness. However, conspiracy theories ignore these corrective structures and treat any failure, anomaly, or undesirable outcome as proof of systemic betrayal. They invert the logic of accountability. The more transparent a process becomes, the more data there is to distort or misinterpret. In this way, transparency, a hallmark of lawful process, becomes ammunition for conspiratorial thinking. A redacted document becomes evidence of a cover-up. A procedural delay becomes proof of sabotage. Social media and digital platforms have amplified the reach and speed of conspiracy theories to an unprecedented degree. Algorithms prioritize engagement over truth, meaning that emotionally charged and divisive content is more likely to spread. False claims can circulate widely before they are debunked, and corrections rarely reach the same audience or carry the same impact. In this environment, conspiracy theories are not isolated errors in judgment, but persistent forces shaping political discourse. The dominance of these narratives makes it harder for lawful processes to be heard, let alone respected. The noise of misinformation overwhelms the quiet, methodical work of justice. Moreover, conspiratorial thinking is self-sealing. Attempts to debunk or refute a conspiracy are often interpreted as part of the conspiracy itself. When courts dismiss claims for lack of evidence, the response is not to accept the legal ruling, but to accuse the courts of complicity. When journalists fact-check falsehoods, they are labeled as agents of the cover-up. This epistemic closure creates an impenetrable belief system that cannot be corrected from within. It becomes a parallel reality, immune to facts, where only the insiders know the truth, and everyone else is suspect. In such a climate, lawful process becomes not merely ineffective but dangerous for those who rely on it. Election officials, judges, prosecutors, and even regular citizens may face threats for doing their jobs or speaking the truth. When legal accountability is met with intimidation, when truth-telling requires personal risk, the incentive structure shifts towards silence and compliance. Institutions that should serve the public interest are instead opted or neutralized by fear. The rule of law cannot function when its enforcers are targeted, its rulings ignored, and its legitimacy questioned by default. The damage is not confined to the moment of crisis. Even after a conspiracy theory has been discredited, its effects linger. People may remember the accusation more vividly than the exoneration. Public confidence, once shaken, does not automatically rebound. Voters may disengage, officials may resign, and future decisions may be distorted by a desire to appease rather than uphold principle. The chilling effect of conspiracy is cumulative, slowly undermining the resilience of democratic institutions and processes over time. What begins as a fringe belief can, through repetition and political amplification, become a mainstream position, altering the expectations and norms of public discourse. The long-term consequences of choosing conspiracy over lawful process are profound. It sets a precedent that legal outcomes are negotiable, not final. That truth is whatever the loudest voice claims it to be, that disagreement justifies disbelief. Such a precedent is inherently destabilizing. It invites every future conflict to be fought not in courts or legislatures, but in the arena of mass suspicion. In this environment, good faith debate becomes nearly impossible. Facts are dismissed before they are examined, motives are impugned before they are understood, and outcomes are contested not on their merits, but on their alignment with prior belief. The lure of conspiracy is powerful because it provides meaning in a complex world. It reduces multifaceted issues to simple explanations, identifies clear enemies, and validates the emotions of those who feel marginalized or betrayed. But this psychological comfort comes at a high civic cost. It hollows out the institutional structures that exist to mediate conflict peacefully and equitably. In rejecting lawful process, conspiracy replaces the rule of law with the rule of suspicion, and in doing so, threatens the very idea of democratic governance. Defense of truth in the public sphere is not merely a matter of ethics or intellectual integrity. It is the lifeline of any functioning democracy and a prerequisite for rational decision-making. In an age where information is abundant and often distorted, defending truth has become a deliberate and active responsibility rather than a passive outcome. Truth is not self-sustaining, it must be articulated, supported, and protected from the corrosive forces of misinformation, propaganda, and willful deceit. The public sphere, which includes the media, political discourse, education, and civic dialogue, depends on some baseline agreement about what constitutes a fact, how we arrive at it, and why it matters. Without this agreement, shared reality fractures into competing narratives, and the very concept of truth becomes politicized and relative. When the truth is no longer a common ground but a partisan tool, the ability to govern, legislate, and even converse becomes compromised. Public policy requires factual assessments of problems, economic indicators, scientific data, legal facts, historical context. If these are dismissed as subjective or conspiratorial depending on political convenience, then there is no reliable basis for crafting solutions. Every issue becomes a battlefield of competing claims, with no adjudicating mechanism that all parties accept. This descent into epistemic chaos undermines not just the content of public life, but its very structure. The truth must not be optional. It must be the starting point for all serious discussion. The challenge in defending truth lies partly in its vulnerability to distortion. Lies are often more attractive than truths because they cater to emotional needs, affirm prior beliefs, and offer clarity where reality is complex. A falsehood that provides reassurance or justifies anger may be more persuasive than a truth that demands self-reflection or acceptance of ambiguity. The human mind is susceptible to confirmation bias, tribal loyalty, and cognitive dissonance. These psychological tendencies make it easier for falsehoods to gain traction, especially when they are repeated by influential voices and embedded in appealing narratives. Defending truth, therefore, involves more than presenting facts. It requires cultivating the habits of mind that enable individuals to engage with facts honestly and critically. Education is a primary defense mechanism in this effort. Critical thinking, scientific literacy, and media analysis are not luxuries, they are essential skills for citizenship. Students must learn how to evaluate sources, distinguish argument from assertion, and recognize rhetorical manipulation. They must be taught to value intellectual humility, the understanding that being wrong is not shameful, but part of the process of learning. Without these tools, Individuals are more likely to be swayed by demagoguery and less likely to question their own assumptions. A well-informed public is not immune to deception, but it is more resilient against it. The media also plays a central role in the defense of truth, though it faces mounting challenges in the digital age. Journalistic standards such as fact-checking, multiple sourcing, and editorial independence are designed to ensure accuracy and accountability. However, the rise of infotainment, echo chambers, and algorithm-driven content has made it easier for falsehoods to spread and harder for reliable information to gain visibility. Financial pressures and ideological segmentation have fragmented the media landscape, creating environments where audiences can choose their version of reality. To defend truth in such a landscape, journalists must double down on transparency, methodological rigor, and a willingness to challenge both power and popular prejudice. Political leadership, too, has a unique responsibility. When elected officials lie, obfuscate, or traffic in half-truths, they do more than mislead. They legitimize dishonesty as a tool of governance. The damage is not confined to a single issue or administration. It ripples outward, lowering the standard of discourse and encouraging cynicism. Citizens come to expect that all political speech is manipulative, that truth is always secondary to strategy, and that integrity is a liability. This erosion of expectations creates a moral vacuum in which anything goes, and the loudest or most theatrical narrative wins. Politicians who speak the truth, even when it is unpopular or costly, model a form of civic courage that is indispensable to democratic health. Social media platforms, although private companies, exert enormous influence over the public sphere. Their algorithms prioritize engagement, often promoting content that provokes outrage or reinforces bias. This creates an environment where sensationalism outpaces substance and misinformation spreads more rapidly than correction. Defending truth requires these platforms to take greater responsibility for the information ecosystems they cultivate. Content moderation, algorithmic transparency, and support for credible journalism are not forms of censorship, they are acts of stewardship over the digital commons. While the line between regulation and overreach must be carefully navigated, the current laissez-faire approach has proven inadequate. Citizens themselves are not passive recipients in this struggle, they are the front line. The defense of truth begins with individual choices. Whether to share an article before checking its credibility, whether to challenge a falsehood in a conversation, whether to examine one's own assumptions before condemning others. It involves the courage to say, "I don't know," rather than invent an answer, the discipline to seek out dissenting views, and the integrity to revise one's beliefs when the evidence demands it. These may seem like small acts, but collectively they shape the tenor of public life. A society where individuals take truth seriously is one that resists manipulation and maintains the capacity for self-correction. The legal system also plays a role in this landscape, not just by punishing defamation or fraud, but by upholding standards of evidence and adjudication. Courtrooms are among the few remaining spaces in public life where truth is systematically pursued through structured rules. Witnesses are sworn in, claims are tested, and decisions are based on documented facts. When legal findings are rejected in favor of unfounded accusations or conspiracy narratives, it is not just the specific case at stake. It is the authority of a truth-seeking institution. The public must understand that legal procedures are not political maneuvers, but disciplined processes designed to separate fact from fiction. Even in art and literature, the defense of truth finds expression. Writers, filmmakers, and artists explore the tension between illusion and reality, between comfort and confrontation. Art has the power to expose hidden truths, challenge dominant narratives, and remind audiences of the human cost of lies. While not bound by the same standards as journalism or science, art contributes to the cultural understanding that truth matters and that its distortion is not without consequence. The stories a society tells itself reflect its values when those stories honor truth. Even through metaphor or allegory, they strengthen the moral fabric of the culture. The defense of truth is not about achieving unanimity or silencing dissent. It is about maintaining a shared framework within which disagreement can occur constructively. People will always interpret facts differently, prioritize values differently, and advocate for divergent policies. But these differences can only be meaningfully negotiated when there is agreement that facts exist, that methods for discovering them are valid, and that changing one's mind in light of new evidence is not weakness but wisdom. Without this framework, debate devolves into spectacle, and governance becomes a contest of force rather than persuasion.